Now let's turn to the economic problem that every society must solve. So in this section, we're going to discuss how an economy answers the following questions. What goods and services will be produced? How will the goods and services be produced? And who will receive the goods and services that we produce? So remember, in this world of scarcity that we live in, we have limited economic resources to satisfy our desires. Because of this, we face trade-offs and we're forced to make decisions between what products we want, what things we want to do with our time, all these different things. Because, again, we face these limits, the scarcity that constantly exists. So trade-offs are the idea that because of the scarcity, producing more of one good or service means producing less of another good or service for producers. For consumers, for you or I, because of scarcity, the consumption of one good or service, or the purchase of one good or service, means that we can purchase fewer other goods or services. So the first question, what goods and services will be produced in an economy? Well, individuals, firms, and governments all must come together to decide on what goods or services should be produced. An increase in production of one good requires a reduction in the production of some other good. Again, because of scarcity, we have the limits to the resources we have. We have to make these choices. Because an increase in production of one good reduces the production of another good, this is what we call trade-off. So when you're trying to decide whether to make an additional unit of a good or not, and you realize you have to give up the production of another good, this is an opportunity of what we call opportunity cost. So every single activity has a cost, and this trade-off is the opportunity cost. So for instance, if I eat dinner out, I can't also go to a movie at the same time, so I have to make that choice. So the opportunity cost of me going to that restaurant is going to the movie. You can think of the opportunity cost as the cost of what you're giving up, the best alternative of what you could do, what you could produce, however you're looking at it. So, for example, the opportunity cost of increasing funding for space exploration. Let's say we want to fund NASA more, or we want to found and put money into the Space Force. We might have to give up the opportunity to fund cancer research. There's only so much money to go around, so we have to make choices between where we want to put that money. The next question facing society is how will the goods and services be produced? A firm might have several different methods for producing its goods and services, and there's a number of different raw materials they can use in the production of goods. So, for example, a music producer can make a song sound good by either hiring a great singer and using standard production techniques, or hiring a more mediocre singer and using autotune to correct the inaccuracies they have, make the voice sound better. So music producers have a choice. How do they want to actually make this music? For another example, as the cost of manufacturing labor changes, a firm might respond by either changing its production technique to one that employs more machines and fewer workers, or moving its factory to a location with cheaper labor. Finally, we have the question of who will receive the goods and services produced. So in a market economy, the way that people receive goods and services, how we determine who's going to get what, is that they go into the market and they purchase those goods. So the people with the most willingness and ability to pay for good are those that are able to obtain those services. Now, we can have changes in tax and welfare policies to change the distribution of income. By changing distribution of income, by giving low-income people more income, they have more money to spend, so that'll change who receives the goods and services produced. It gives them more purchasing power and more ability to purchase these goods. So now there's different ways that different societies choose to answer those questions, the three questions that we just talked about. They can be categorized broadly into three types of economies. So the first is a centrally planned economy. In this economy, the government decides how economic resources will be allocated. They determine how goods will be produced, what goods will be produced, and who receives those goods that are produced. There's very few truly centrally planned economies in the world anymore. The best example of a centrally planned economy is the former Soviet Union. Next is the market economy. In a market economy, all the decisions of households and firms interacting in the market are what allocate economic resources. So we have a mutually beneficial exchange between two parties that voluntarily get together to decide to purchase, and that helps determine the price. And through the pricing mechanism, which we're going to talk about later, um, that's how we determine what goods are going to be produced, what's the best uses of goods. Finally, there's a mixed economy. Mixed economy is an economy in which most economic decisions result from the interactions of buyers and sellers in the market, but in which the government plays a significant role in the allocation of resources. They may set prices for different goods and services. They may be engaged directly in the production in some industries, or they might have very strong regulatory policies that really shapes how market participants interact with each other. There's no true examples of market economy anymore. I think the United States is the closest example to a market economy. Mixed economy is typically what we see, where government still has a large influence, yet most of what's going on is determined by the interaction of buyers and sellers. Most European countries are a pretty good example of mixed economies because their government plays a more significant role than the United States government in market activities, but there's still the private ownership of property and of firms, and they use the pricing mechanism and the markets in general to determine how resources should be allocated. Both in practice and in theory, market economies tend to be more efficient than centrally planned economies. So, market economies, ones in which decision making is decentralized among firms and consumers, competition reigns supreme. We tend to have both productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. So, in productive efficiency, goods and services are produced at the lowest possible cost. Because firms face a hard budget constraint, and because they face competition from other firms, they try to make goods at the lowest possible cost so they can earn the highest possible profits and so they can charge the lowest possible price so that they can get more consumers away from other firms. It also leads to allocative efficiency. And this is where the production is in accordance with consumer preferences. Again, because decisions of what to produce aren't being made by central planning boards, it's made by firms that have to appeal to consumers. Consumer preferences have a large role in shaping what goods are actually produced. In particular, and something, again, we're going to talk about more in depth later and we'll flesh this out. Every good or service that is produced up to the point where the last unit provides a marginal benefit to society equal to the marginal cost of producing it. So you're not producing goods that cost more to make than society values them. And you're not leaving money on the table, so to speak. You're not producing where the last unit, the marginal benefit, is greater than the marginal cost to society. So there's still more gains to be made. So market economies tend to end up with both productive and allocative efficiency. So what is the source of this economic efficiency that results from markets? Productive efficiency comes about because of the competition between firms for consumers, and competition between consumers as they try to buy goods. The allocative efficiency, this arises due to voluntary exchange. Parties aren't forced to engage in exchange, so they'll only act when they both make themselves better off. The voluntary exchange is a situation that occurs in markets when both the buyers and the sellers of a product are made better off by the transaction. Now, this is possible because of what we call subjective value. The value of all goods and services are subjective. They're not actually set in stone, and they're not based on the cost of actually producing those resources. So the value of a good varies with each individual's preferences. And we don't judge one person's preferences to be better or worse than another. So value is determined by what each individual is willing and able to pay for it. So each transaction that takes place improves the well-being of the buyer and the seller. Transactions continue until there's no further improvements that can take place. And that's what leads us to this allocative efficiency. Now, there are some caveats I should mention about market economies. Markets may not result in fully efficient outcomes. So, for example, people might not immediately do things the most efficient way. There is an astounding lack of knowledge that's constantly present. The knowledge discovery process is very long, time-consuming, and expensive, so we're forced to act with imperfect knowledge. And we do this on a daily basis, almost constantly. But because of this, we may not do things in the most inefficient way. We're not truly at that most allocative or the production efficiency level. Also, governments might interfere with market outcomes. They typically do this because there are other goals than productive and allocative efficiency. There are concerns of fairness, concerns of safety that aren't fully captured in market transactions and like through the free market process. Finally, market outcomes might ignore the desires of people who are not involved in transactions. So, for example, pollution. If there's pollution in the production of good or service, um, there are third parties, people that are not buying that good or service, that may deal with the effects of pollution. So, in that case, markets, as they're structured, can't deal with that. Because of these things, and there are some other minor things, um, economically efficient outcomes may not be the most desirable thing, or they may not result from the free market. We'll learn, or you'll learn more about these caveats, these problems with market economies, and if you go on to take an Econ 102 class. So let's briefly look at economic models and try to break down and understand how we use economic models and what they are. So economists develop these models to analyze real-world issues. So when we're trying to build a model, we often follow these steps. You decide on the assumptions to use in developing the model, and this is very important to explicitly state and understand those assumptions and what they mean. Once we do that, we formulate a testable hypothesis. What are we actually studying? What do we think is going to happen? We then use data to try to test that hypothesis. Once we get the results of those tests, if it confirms our hypothesis, that's great. If it doesn't confirm our hypothesis, then we may need to revise the model if it doesn't explain what's going on. And finally, we retain the revised model to help answer similar economic questions in the future. So when I work with models of the labor market, my research area is occupational licensing and healthcare scope of practice laws. So when I'm looking at those, the models I use to understand and estimate people's earnings, that comes from a paper from 1958, where Jacob Inser used a lot of demographic variables that come into play to help control for people's wages. So we retain these models and we use these for a long period of time if they help accurately anticipate what's going on and can help explain what's going on. Every economic model is going to have assumptions and simplifications. There are so many things going on in the real world that if we didn't use assumptions and we didn't simplify away from that, it'd be so unwieldy we wouldn't be able to capture any results. So it's very important to include these. And for assumptions and simplifications, it's very important to, if you're especially if you're doing research, to explicitly state them so other people reading your work understand what you're simplifying away from. So while economic models may not perfectly and accurately describe what's going on in the world, so say if you're looking for the effect of a new regulation on wages, you may not be able to predict exactly what that effect on wages is, but you can get the direction. You can understand if this is going to increase wages or decrease wages. Will it be by a lot or by a little? You may not get the exact dollar and cents, but it gives you a feel for what's going on and can help explain what's going on. Now, every good model generates testable predictions, something that you can get some data for and see, is this true or is it false? Is the model good or is the model bad? And you can verify and disprove it using that data. Now, economic variables are something that's measurable that can have different values. So it can be things like income of doctors, but we can break it down by demographics. We can do race and gender. We can do age. We can break it down by what type of medical school they go to, what state they live in, all these sorts of things that aren't, pure dollars and cents are still economic variables and things we can use in our economic models. Now, there's two types of analysis I want to briefly touch on. Economists try to mimic the natural sciences and the physical sciences by using the scientific method. But economics is a social science, even though we have this physics envy where we want to draw everything out in equations, be very rigorous and complicated for it. And studying the behavior of people is often tricky. So when we analyze human behavior, we can perform either positive analysis or normative analysis. Positive analysis is a means-end framework. So this is analysis that's concerned with what's going on. So we're trying to describe the process of what's happening. We're not making any sort of judgments. So if there's an increase in the money supply, we'll see an increase in inflation. That's positive analysis. One thing happens, what's the effect of that? On the other hand, there's normative analysis. And this analysis concerned with what ought to be. So we're making value judgments here. Is this good for society? Is this bad for society? So returning to the inflation example, instead of describing what's happening to increase the inflation, normative analysis, a normative question might ask, is this increase in inflation good for people, good for an economy, or is it bad? And for that, it's less rigorous rather than just describing what's happened like an impartial observer. You're making arguments. You're using facts. You're using um, different theories or arguments to try to prove or try to convince people why one thing is better or one thing is worse. Now, as economists, we mostly prefer positive analysis. If you read economic research, it will mostly be positive analysis, but there's often some normative analysis at the end. So we've discovered this thing, we described this process of what's going on. Now, is this good or is this bad? Should we do more of it? Should we do less of it? So there's a role for both, although we try to stick, and in this class, we will primarily stick to positive analysis. Now I'd like to briefly touch on the difference between macroeconomics and microeconomics. Microeconomics is a study of how households and firms make choices, how households and firms interact with each other in the market, and how the government attempts to influence those choices. It's focused in on specific industries and a lot of personal human decision making, how we reach these decisions, how we choose to act. On the other hand, macroeconomics is a study of the economy as a whole, including topics like inflation, unemployment, economic growth, international trade, um, and monetary policy. We're going to stick to mostly macroeconomics in this class, although we will do some microeconomics in the following 2 or 3 chapters to help build up the basics of economics so we can, use this analysis for the macroeconomics we do later in the course. So here's some examples of issues in microeconomics and issues in macroeconomics. The macroeconomics, why do economies experience periods of recession and increasing unemployment? Why over the long run have some economies grown faster than others? What determines the inflation rate or the value of the US dollar? Can government interventions reduce the severity of recessions? Whereas microeconomics, these are more focused. How do consumers react to changes in product prices? How do firms decide what prices to charge for the products they sell? Which government policy would be the most efficient at reducing teen smoking? What are the costs and benefits of approving the sale of a new prescription drug? And what's the most efficient way to reduce air pollution? In 101, like I said, we're talking about macroeconomic issues primarily. But in Econ 102, if you go on to take the principles of microeconomics, you'll focus on the questions on the left side here, these microeconomic issues. Finally, I'd like to end the first chapter with just a note about important economic terms. So like all fields of study, economics uses terms or specific jargon related to the field with specific precise meanings. So now sometimes these terms will be used in ways that are different from closely related disciplines or from the way we talk about it in the real world. The best example of that is rationality. The way we use rationality is slightly different than people use it in everyday conversations. A couple other examples. There's technology. When economists use the word technology, we're talking about the processes that a firm uses to produce goods and services. This can be improvements in physical technology, like how we typically define technology, but it could also be just different production processes, different management techniques, things like that aren't typically thought of as technology. And capital. When we refer to capital, we mean manufactured goods that are used to produce other goods and services. So these are things used in the production process. Again, slightly different definition than in everyday usage. So remember to pay close attention to the terms that we define in class and in the textbook in case they're different from how you typically use them.